my last video, I talked about what's going on with the status of Star Wars and with the things that have been going on, the disarray that there is. In this video, I'm going to break down a little bit more about why that's happening, and I'm going to talk specifically to the nature of Star Wars fans and how they're connected to it. In the last introductory video, I mentioned that there were 5 types of Star Wars fans, but I didn't say what they were. And that's deliberate. In this series, I'm going to go ahead and list each type of fan. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the disastrous state of the sequel trilogy. In the last video, we talked about the problems going on with the current Star Wars franchise. We asked why it's happening. In this video, we're going to talk about why it's happening and attempt to explain what's going on a little further. To really understand what's going on with Star Wars and why its fans are frustrated, outraged, delighted, or disappointed, you have to understand Star Wars fans themselves, or the state of the fandom as a whole, and I believe I mentioned this in the last video. Historically, looking back, the original Star Wars came out in 1977, meaning if you were born after 1965, you probably saw it as a child, and if you were born after 1970, you definitely saw it as a child. If you were born before that, you would have seen it as an adult. We'll come back to this group a little later. I know there are people out there who may not have seen it as children and may have seen it later in life. We'll come back to this group later as well, since this group is the exception and not the rule. But the overwhelming majority of people who've seen Star Wars who are younger than baby boomers saw it first as kids. At the time, in 1977, the original Star Wars blew the lid off of all moviegoers' expectations of what a movie could be and do. With its mythic archetypal story, its hero's journey, strong protagonist, hodgepodge of fairy tale, science fiction, western, samurai, and war story elements. At the time, state-of-the-art visual effects, fully immersive world building, it impressed and delighted all. The movie's effect far surpassed its target audience. What? Star Wars had a target audience? Yes, it did. Even back then, movies were made with demographics in mind. So, what was the target market for Star Wars? According to George Lucas, the target audience is kids, specifically 12-year-olds.
But then when I started to go into Star Wars, they said, why are you making a children's film? I said, well, because I think I can have more of an influence on people. And I think I can have things to say that I can actually influence kids, adolescents, 12-year-olds. And, that are trying to make their way into the bigger world. And that's basically what mythology was to say, I'm saying, this is what we believe in, these are our rules, this is what we are as a society.
According to George Lucas, that's who all 6 of his Star Wars films are aimed at. And it explains a lot. Now, even though this thing was intended for kids, for tweens as it were, it went viral though. It appealed not just to kids, but to all types of people due to its mythic archetypal storytelling. The hero's journey is so successful in popular culture because everyone can relate to it. Also, movies for kids sometimes have a mass cultural impact if they're well made, because every adult has an inner child inside of them. Consider these examples.
Remember who you are. You are my son, and the one true king. Remember.
It definitely hit its target audience of kids, though, as the sales of Star Wars action figures at the time showed. Kids, teens, and adults could all relate to this story. Critics at the time were blown away by the outstanding special effects of that time. And if you think, yeah, it's just another old movie with old visual effects, well, that might make sense by today's standards, but if you go back and watch science fiction films pre-Star Wars and post-Star Wars, you can definitely see the effect that it had. It boosted the movie's storyteller's toolkit into hyperspace, as it were. Speaking of movie makers, filmmakers were delighted with the new storytelling tools created that they could add to their toolboxes. There was better visual effects, there was excellent creative design and makeup, there were realistic-looking spaceships, exciting battle sequences. There was long-form episodic storytelling in films, which really wasn't a thing much before that. I mean, they had the Saturday matinees, but that was more like what we have today with TV serials. So long-form episodic storytelling in films, as it were, sort of started with Star Wars. It also established the trilogy as the central film structure for epic movie franchises. The ripples Star Wars created can be seen and felt in tons of movies and TV shows that came afterwards. The industry also changed. It pivoted. In 1980, when The Empire Strikes Back came out, Star Wars' very first sequel surpassed the original in every way. It is generally lauded to this day as the best Star Wars film. It also set the template for what movie sequels could be, and the industry pivoted from standalone dramas to long-form episodic franchises, which is still the norm today. Transformers, Marvel Cinematic Universe, Fast and Furious, DC Universe, the list goes on. Every action-adventure has to be a series with sequel potential. A tentpole franchise with cross-merchandising opportunities. All this merchandising kept Star Wars in the public eye a lot more than it might have been. And it came at the right moment, too, with home video technology emerging and becoming a de facto babysitter for a whole generation. Anybody else remember those Disney VHS tapes in those enormous clamshell cases? I sure do. The results of its mass appeal, continuous merchandising, and successful series of sequels, easily rewatchable from the comfort of your own home, resulted in a multi-generational fandom much larger than any other property had ever known. Since so many fans were introduced to it as children by their parents who loved it as children, it's a positive part of their childhood and therefore is like a family inheritance, family pastime, a source of rosy nostalgia, and something that they feel like they have a special claim on or ownership of. All we need to do is look at the ad campaign surrounding the release of The Force Awakens for ample evidence of this.
Everything okay, bud?
I'm not sure yet. Hurry. You're our only hope.
This is Red 2. Come in, Red Leader.
Red Leader standing by.
You got the best Jedi in the whole universe. Guess what? Started out as a farm boy.
Really? The Force. It's all around us. It binds us together, guides our actions, helps us do yoga.
Is he really his father?
The Force is strong in my family.
Think about it. People who are into sports are often into sports because their parents are into sports. Their parents share that passion with them and enroll them in Little League, where they have experiences, they learn to love it, they grow closer to their family. My family had a similar tradition with science fiction. I grew up loving Star Trek and Star Wars, and a lot of other kids did too. So, the result is that you have this huge fan base that's still growing and continues to grow as these children become adults and pass on this inheritance to their own children. What we have is a fan base that spans 3 or 4 generations, each with different expectations and sensibilities about what the movies should be because they were each raised in a different zeitgeist. You ever hear people complain about the original trilogy not being as good as the prequels because of the visual effects? If you want to tell me that that isn't evidence of the zeitgeist you were raised in, sorry, but I would shut you down in a heartbeat. No other property has such a large demographic of viewership. So the problem is demographic. It literally cannot appease all of its fans because they're too diverse a group in tastes, interests, ages, and expectations. If you think about Star Wars compared to other standard science fiction films, standard sci-fi has a middle-aged man, heterosexual, middle class, target audience. Some movies are made that only appeal to children. But every now and then, something comes along which crosses a few demographics. Disney Pixar movies are a great example because they tend to be loved by both children and adults. There's horror comedy blends like Shaun of the Dead, so it's possible to make something that appeals to multiple demographics, but it takes both skill and discernment. The problem here, as I've previously mentioned, is that the demographic is too wide. The reason that current Star Wars films are having so many problems and mixed reception and fan backlash is that they aren't considering their entire fan base when they're making them. When they're being made, only a fraction of the fan base is being considered, and which fraction being considered varies depending on who's involved in the project. So, let's break it down here. There are 5 types of Star Wars fans. The first type of Star Wars fan. Drumroll, please. Based on what I've said so far in the video, you guys might have already guessed it. You're pretty smart. It's kids. So let's talk about what kids are, what they like, what they are like, and what they want in a movie. Kids want to learn things and explore.
There's so many. Do they all have a system of planets?
Kids soak up new knowledge with a sponge. Kids are also pretty goofy. They're also really cute. They're okay with viewing others as being goofy and cute also, because when you're a kid, that's what you are. So other kids around you are also goofy and cute, and that's the world that you live in. How many times have you ever seen kids look at another kid and say, "Aw, they're so cute"? Adults do it all the time, and it makes sense because, adults aren't goofy and cute, but kids are. But kids recognize cuteness, and they appreciate it just as much. Kids like to have fun. They don't really like it when their fun gets interrupted by boring, mundane, day-to-day stuff.
But I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters.
Kids also tend to fantasize about having greater power and privileges. Kids see themselves as the hero of their own story. They want to see themselves as the heroes of stories they're watching as well. Children will be much more invested in a movie where a child is the hero and is growing and developing. They also want to pretend to be the heroes through dramatic play. Action figures, costumes, toy lightsabers, anyone. If we think about it, The Phantom Menace is their movie for one generation. If we look at The Phantom Menace, Anakin is goofy, he's kind of cute. Jar Jar is goofy. We see Anakin as the hero of the story in one aspect, where he wants greater power and privileges.
I had a dream I was a Jedi. I came back here and freed all the slaves.
Ends up leaving home to attain them. He's forced into a situation where he has to grow and learn. And he also accidentally saves the day. It's a story that wouldn't appeal really to adults, but it has all the trappings of what kids want in a movie. It's not a bad movie. It's a movie for kids. And if you can't accept something that's for kids as being good, then you're narrow-minded. And that's really all I have to say about that. In an interview with Dave Filoni talking about Star Wars The Clone Wars, Season 5, he talked about how films for kids influenced him. Particularly The Goonies influenced the arc about the Jedi younglings building their lightsabers. That was a great arc that had David Tennant guest starring as a droid, and I would highly recommend it for anyone who hasn't seen it. He mentioned specifically that George always points out about Star Wars being for kids, and that the reason he chose to make more Star Wars after he was done with his film saga as cartoons might particularly be to get it to the audience that he's trying to reach, and not to people who he's not aiming at. So what you have is an interesting phenomenon. Most people ignore the Star Wars cartoons because they're cartoons, they're for kids, and they assume that it won't appeal to their more adult nature. Some adults watch it with their kids, or watch it because they're curious to see what was made. And what they find is a cartoon aimed at kids, but that blows the lid off what children's storytelling can be and do. What I've seen is that any adult who goes in with an open mind about this show and watches it through to completion, you can't just do a few episodes and stop, finds a rich, lush narrative that expands the world of Star Wars, that answers questions that the prequels posed but weren't answered, and that causes you to see the original trilogy in a whole different light. It's an amazing cinematic work, and yes, it's for kids. I have an inner child, and I'm totally okay with things for kids. That's enough about that. First type of fan is kids. Look at the evidence. You got toys, you got cartoon shows, you got pop culture media, all of the Star Wars films that are made by George Lucas directly, including the Clone Wars animated feature and the Clone Wars animated series, not to mention the 2 made-for-TV movies from the 80s. All feature a main protagonist who is either a kid, a teen, or an adult under the age of 25. I mean, Han even refers to Luke as kid for the entirety of the original trilogy, for crying out loud. I rest my case. Star Wars is made for kids. It's a movie for kids, about kids, facing their coming-of-age challenges, and the primary fan base and target demographic it's aimed at are kids.